we are going to, listeners, segue right into our next discussions without going on a break. And this has to do with the electoral preparedness and the crucial talk that is going on in this discourse surrounding political elections, from the voting list to anti corruption strategies. And we're joined online this afternoon by the Director of Elections, Orette Fisher. Mr. Fisher, good afternoon and welcome.
Good afternoon. Thank you.
All right. My first question to you is, how ready is the EOJ for the pending election? Should the Prime Minister this afternoon say that the elections will be somewhere about the 10th or the 15th of December, how ready is the EOJ?
And I'm satisfied that we are in a position to conduct the election if and when called.
Hmm.
hmm
And what brings you to that satisfaction, if you might just say to our listeners?
Okay, well, briefly, there are a number of things that we needed to acquire in terms
Hmm.
of equipment and so on, and we have done that. There are people who we needed to recruit and to train and have those in place. We have done that. We have identified polling locations, counting centers, nomination centers, and so on. So we are basically at a position where we would now move to phase two, which would be actual fine tuning and deployment of equipment and so on, printing of ballots and all that.
Orrette Fisher, you at the EOJ and the ECJ, you would be recognizing that as a general matter, the interest in voting in Jamaica is trending down. And being that you're in the business of coordinating national elections, sir, you must be very concerned about that. Does the EOJ have any strategies in place to shore up the interest of Jamaicans in exercising their franchise?
Well, actually, our job is to ensure that persons are able to vote, in a very transparent manner, with easy access and so on. The whole issue of asking persons to come out and vote, we do in a general sense, but we try not to do any targeted
Mm-hmm.
to target any specific area because you
Mm-hmm.
could be accused of seeking to influence the outcome in that particular area. So I think really and truly it would be a combination of the electoral office making sure that everything is in place to facilitate people coming out and to vote, and the political parties ensuring that the issues are there that will entice people to come out and vote and to make people see the need to vote for one or the other.
Mm-hmm. Orrette Fisher, I know that Jamaica has made numerous strides in ensuring, as you just said, that the voting process is fair and transparent. But a number of our listeners, a number of persons, still wonder whether some of the things that we hear about, whispered about, vote buying, stuffing the ballot boxes, etc., still occur. As the director of elections, what would you say to them this afternoon in terms of how far your organization has come in ensuring that those practices are completely eradicated from the process?
I'll go as far as to say a lot of the things that you hear are things that are anecdotal, are things
Mm-hmm.
that were the legacy of the past and are no longer practiced or no longer takes place. No
Mm-hmm.
one can point out to me. I've been at the electoral office for 20 years, not directors for all that time. But no one can point out to me when any ballot box would have been stolen or when any would have disappeared since that time. But you hear it all the time.
Mm-hmm.
And every election, we have been able to account for every single ballot box, bar none.
Yes.
We have methods in place to deal with stuffing of ballot box, which I honestly wouldn't want to go into any details, but the areas
Understandable.
where we have those concerns, we have measures in place to deal with that. But in terms of the vote buying, that is something that is of a major concern and should be to the country in general.
Mm-hmm.
So while I am unable to speak specifically to vote buying incidents because
Yes.
this would not take place within the precinct of the electoral office or within any of our operations, so there's nothing I can speak to. But I listened to the people who spoke after the Western and Central by-election, for example,
Mm-hmm.
and on the television, and they spoke about being paid. And it is of concern to me because I think that, and it should be to all well-thinking Jamaicans,
Yes.
because I think it corrupts the system and it is illegal, and therefore it is something that the police, the country, should look at And if there's anything that we can do, then we would. But like I said, the staff of the electoral office are not really in a position to see and to hear of those things specifically on the ground because it wouldn't take place within the polling station.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Our job is to ensure that if somebody should seek to do that, that they are unable to know whether or not the person actually voted the way they should. Because we make sure that the vote is secret. So if you pay somebody to vote a particular way, you're taking a chance.
Right. Are you satisfied, Mr. Fisher, that the EOJ, the ECJ, is being adequately funded by the state such that you can meet all your needs and requirements to do the very important job that you are assigned?
I'll break it down in two. In terms of elections, yes, we are funded so that we can adequately conduct the elections. In terms of some of the other activities that we would like to carry out between elections, then the answer is no. There are times when there are things that we would like to do, but we are not adequately funded to do that. And I suppose you could say, to that extent, we are probably casualties of the fiscal, fiscal response that the country is going through.
Mm-hmm. And you talk about the other activities that you have to conduct between elections, and I want to zoom in specifically on the verification and updating of the voters list, which much has been made about recently. In terms of that overall process, could you give us an indication of what the list looks like in terms of your best estimate in terms of how many dead and deceased people are on it, and how much it would you think would cost, a ballpark figure, to ensure that the list is current, up to date, and is in the best state that it possibly could be in?
Okay, well, to do what we would call a residence re-verification exercise, where we would visit the home of every single elector to make sure that they are alive and that they are living where they are registered, and then to effect any transfer that is necessary. That is going to cost us approximately just over $2 billion, And that is one of the exercises that we would have loved to carry out, which we were unable to carry out. In terms of some of the things that we wanted to do a comprehensive dead elector removal exercise, a more targeted exercise. And we were not given the funds to do that. But the important thing that you should note is that dead persons or persons who are not present in Jamaica at this point in time will not be able to vote based on the measures that we have put in place. So while I agree that there are persons who have migrated who should be off, and persons who are dead, whose names should be removed, I am saying that those persons will not be able to vote or anybody to vote for them. And therefore, while in terms of the statistics and so on, it is very important that the list reflect the actual number of eligible voters, the election will not be impacted by those persons voting for persons who are dead or absent. In terms of numbers, I prefer not to go into that at this point in time.
Okay.
But there are some persons on the list who have died and whose names ought to be removed, and there are persons who no longer reside in the country, and that is a little bit more difficult to estimate. But the fact is, if these persons come home, they are allowed to vote because the law says once your name is on the list, you are eligible to vote.
But let me ask you this, Orette Fisher, Director of Elections, because one of the concerns was the list. Yes, right. A number of persons have been enumerated, and so the question is, given the timeline that the Prime Minister has to work with, we know that an election will not be called by the list coming out November 30th. Are we going to see those new persons on the list when that list is published on November 30?
Well, you said you know that, but I am not so sure what you know. But I don't know when the election will be called, and therefore I cannot.
I'm working on a timeline now, Mr. Fisher, because given the timeline that we have to work with in terms of nomination and the 16 to 23 clear days, we can fairly assume that the elections won't be before the 30th of November. And so can I then ask if the new persons will be on the list when that list comes out on the 30th?
Okay, I tried not to interpret the law for anyone, but rather to refer them to the section. But I'll say this for you and your listeners. As to which list will be used, totally dependent on when the election is announced and not so much when it is held. In other words, the list is predicated on nomination day. So depending on when nomination day is, that will determine which list. And if it's the present list, then it means those persons will not be added. If it's the new list, that will be used depending on when nomination day is announced, or then those persons will be included. So it's all predicated on nomination day, and that will determine which list. But if the list to be used is the old list, there's no way that the new persons can be added.
And let me ask you then, Mr. Fisher, would any of the parties can fairly say that they are at a disadvantage with the old list?
I have no idea who the people, the newly registered people, intend to vote for. I have absolutely no idea. I would not be able to speak to advantage or disadvantage. If I could tell you how these people intend to vote, then clearly I could say somebody at a disadvantage. But I have no idea how these people will vote. And so they would have canvassed the list to see or to have an idea. So they are the ones who you'd have to ask to speak to that.
And Mr. Fish, I know that the ECJ has been making several strides in terms of the use of modern technologies in voting. I was reading, for example, one of the reports tabled by the Commission in the Parliament, and it made much about the fact that a lot has been invested in upgrading the voting infrastructure. If you will, could you tell our listeners some of those technologies that you would hope to employ when the date of the election is known?
Well, the most recent thing that we're hoping to have is to actually have statistics on the people who vote, the demographics. In other words, people will say generally that young people are not voting. We're hoping after this election to be able to say people between 18 and 25, so many voted, give you a breakout as to the male, female, and we hope to be able to get at a constituency level, at a national level, and so on. So that's the main new feature that we're hoping to implement. In terms of the other things, we were the first country actually to use the fingerprints to clean the voters list to ensure that persons were on it once, and we developed the whole identification, electronic identification of voters. Now, other countries have moved to electronic voting, but we are still at identification, and that's not because we lack the capability, but more so because the culture of the people were such that we were not prepared to accept that people want to see that what they do actually goes into the box. And so the whole issue of electronic voting was not embraced. It is my personal view that down the road, I cannot say how soon, it is going to happen as technology moves forward and young people get more and more involved and they are more knowledgeable and trusting of the system. But for the time being, that is not an issue that is before the Commission in terms of electronic voting. So that is another new thing that could come into play if and when that becomes a issue for the Commission to decide on.
I want to ask you, Mr. Fisher, about the whole idea of having the general elections and the local elections in one. Do you see that happening anytime in the near future?
Okay, based on the laws presently, there are kept as two separate elections, and that's also our history and our culture. However, I am aware that there are several jurisdictions where multiple elections are held on the same day. Now, what the Commission is moving to do is to ensure that that option is available. So the Commission is looking at what changes would be required in the law and in terms of our preparations and so on, administrative and otherwise, that would facilitate that process should the government of the day decide to have both elections at the same time. The Commission is not in a position to mandate, to instruct, or to request or demand that that be done. So the Commission.
But would
is
that
looking
be
at
a fair
ensuring that
enough recommendation that the Commission would make to the relevant bodies?
So when you look at the cycle of the election, right? If one
Mm-hmm.
is as its president every 3 years and one is every 5 years, it's hardly likely that they would be held together unless one has been delayed or put off. So unless the cycles change to make them coincide, then that recommendation wouldn't make a lot of sense. However, there are times when the local government election is usually put off and has been held shortly after the general election. The commission is therefore saying, let us give the government of the day the option of calling both at the same time, should that should they want to do that. Because presently that is not in place, and those were what the commission sought to put in place.
Mm-hmm. And finally, Mr. Fisher, I want to get your reactions to the whole idea of a fixed date for elections, especially the general election. Do you think that is something that's feasible? Is it workable?
For me, and I'm speaking personally now,
Mm-hmm.
and I am also speaking to some extent for the independent members of the commission. Yes, it is something that we think would be feasible and workable, but unfortunately, our constitution doesn't allow for that at this point in time, and therefore there will be some amendment to the legislation to facilitate that. But it would definitely assist in planning, even if not a fixed date, but more, well, a fixed period, right? And then something would be in place to facilitate early elections depending on whatever is happening if should that need arise. But the guessing game when it can be any time after the government is installed until 3 months after the fifth anniversary. And what the commission and the electoral office has to do is to gauge the posturing and so on in order to figure out whether an election is imminent. And that is something that would save us some money because we sometimes have to double spend when we make preparations and go a few way down the road and the election is not announced. So yes, it is something that I would personally support.
Mm-hmm. Uh, Mr. Fisher, you recently went to Trinidad, I believe, to observe their elections. Final question to you, sir. In terms of what you saw on the ground in Trinidad, could you give our listeners an idea of how their electoral system in any way and their electoral processes differ from Jamaica's, and are there any lessons that could be extracted and applied here?
Well, one of the things that I do whenever I travel to observe elections, I try to see if there is anything that we can take back to improve our process. And I'm going to be honest with you. I think that there are things that we could assist them with in terms of improving their process. Um, the system is basically the same. They are totally manual, so we are ahead of them in terms of that. But one of the things I would love to see would be for the Jamaicans to exercise the kind of patience that I see the Trinidadians exercise when they are in line to vote. Because in Jamaica, the people come out very early, and you'll have 30 people online, and everybody expects to vote. At the same time, you try to explain if it takes 3 minutes for one person to vote, if you multiply 30 people by 3 minutes, then you realize what time it will take the last person on the line to vote. But they get very impatient. But that is one of the things that I would really wish we could take from their election is the patience of the people when they are online to vote.
Mm-hmm. Orette Fisher, listeners, is the Director of Elections. Sir, we want to thank you so very much for joining us and providing such candid, open and frank answers for us and for our listeners.
My pleasure.